Alright, motherfucks. It's your boy back in this bitch. I forgot to do a song intro, so sue me, motherfuckers. Today we're going to talk about something that I was thinking about last night, right? I was watching some TV, and me and my friends started talking about something. You know what I mean? We started talking about what makes things good on TV, right? And I came with two conclusions, right? Number one, things have to be difficult, right? If things are too easy, then it's not good, motherfucks. Now, what do I mean by this? I mean, let's take wrestling, right? Because this first element doesn't apply to all forms of media, because difficulty is not something that, you know, can be assessed on different types of media as easily, right? But let's take wrestling, right? If it's too easy to become a wrestler, the overall product, I can't believe I'm saying the word product like that, I hate that shit, but it's true, right? The overall product suffers tremendously, right? If it's too easy to get on TV, then the bar is lowered on trying hard to be something interesting, right? That's why if you look at the WWE roster, which we'll be doing in tomorrow's video, motherfucks, right? You'll see how many jobbers there really are in this company. Versus, let's say, the Attitude Era, right? Where there were very, very, very few jobbers, right? To double check, I read an article earlier today called 15 Jobbers of the WWE era, of the Attitude Era, and where they are now. Now, a lot of these people I wouldn't even consider jobbers. Some of them were very memorable, you know? Like Bull Buchanan, right? I don't consider him a jobber, you know? He's probably a lower mid-carder, you know what I mean? Like in terms of like he's a tag guy, right? But Bull Buchanan was not a jobber. Bull Buchanan was out there in WrestleMania with Big Boss Man, like wrestling like D'Lo Brown and Godfather, right? Who were both Intercontinental champions, right? Big Boss Man feuded with Undertaker at WrestleMania. You know, I wouldn't consider these guys jobbers, or certainly I wouldn't consider Bull Buchanan to be a jobber on the level of other contemporary jobbers. You know what I mean? Like, for example, comparing Bull Buchanan to Lince Dorado is not accurate, right? Like, Lince Dorado is obviously a much more of a jobber than Bull Buchanan. So, and that was one of like the most jobberish guys there, you know? Now, the Attitude Era did have a few jobbers, no doubt about it, right? Like Stevie Richards, Mean Street Posse, right? There were a few, but pretty much Stevie Richards, because the Mean Street Posse, even though they were jobbers, they were presented as like Shane's lackeys, right? Like they were presented as jobbers, you know what I mean? They weren't these guys that like anyone would ever think are serious wrestlers, right? Like if Pete Gas ever did a move on someone, like the announcers would go crazy, like, oh, Pete Gas, you know? Like nobody knew what their finishers were, right? Because they didn't have any finishers, they didn't finish any matches. So that's what I'm talking about, right? Wrestling was hard back then. It was hard to get into, you know? So the people that made it through are people that are good. And when they make it through, Vince McMahon and the people that are in charge of deciding who wins and who loses, right? They see people and they're like, oh, wait a second, man. We can't have this guy lose. He's pretty good. You know what I mean? Like, all right, he can lose to this guy, but he can win against this guy, right? This is kind of like the invention of 50-50 booking in many ways, right? Which a lot of people think is a product of like the PG era, which is retarded, right? Back in the day, like The Rock and Stone Cold lost all the time. You know what I'm saying? All the time. I mean, they were screwed out of wins, right? But like Triple H's entire title reign was premised around Stone Cold and The Rock losing. You know what I mean? He would cheat, he would trick them, he would run them over with cars, you know? But 50-50 booking was definitely a thing. But it also highlighted how difficult it was to get into wrestling and to become good at wrestling. You know what I mean? Because every jobber would win occasionally, except for like Kai and Tai and Mean Street Posse, right? They would all win occasionally, right? So like, you can't look at someone like Al Snow, for example, and say he's a jobber. Because he was a jobber 1 month, then he was the European champion the next month, and then a few months later he was feuding with The Rock at a pay-per-view. You know, having like a back and forth match with The Rock. So no one really was a jobber, and I believe it's because people were actually really good, so there was no reason to make anyone into jobbers, right? You just rotated who would win and lose, and you would have storylines. Storylines would drive the product, not this notion of who beat who. You know, when you have shitty storylines like AEW, for example, right? You have to rely on the record. But nobody cares about the record because nobody really cares about the storyline. Nobody really cared about wrestlers looking strong or looking good, right? Except for like if you're like a high-level mid-carder. So you'd have someone like Val Venus, right? He might lose 1 month to Goldust. The next month, he's feuding with Shamrock, right? And beating Shamrock, let's say. You know what I mean? And it still felt real because there was a storyline. Oh, like, did Val Venus fuck Shamrock's sister? You know what I mean? There was a storyline, so you weren't really interested in who would do what and who would hit what finisher, right? So things were difficult back then. It was hard to be a wrestler, and therefore there weren't that many spots. Nowadays, everyone's a jobber, so it's like you have like a company, 80% of the wrestlers are complete jobbers, are never going to beat WWE champion, you know? And people are like, well, why isn't this guy a champion? Dude, he's one of the jobbers, you know? It's a different format. It's too easy now, right? Even people that people like today probably wouldn't have a spot on the Attitude Era card. Not because they're not good enough wrestlers, but because there just wasn't enough spots. You know, so people are like, oh, if Daniel Bryan, like fucking who is that? I think it was JR. JR was like, he's like, Dash and Dawson would succeed on every era of wrestling. No, they fucking wouldn't, motherfucks. No, they wouldn't. They wouldn't succeed in the Attitude Era. They would be like the Mean Street Posse. You know, like the amount of character the tag teams had back then was not enough for people like Dash and Dawson to excel. They couldn't be the two tough guy tag team because then you have Farouk and Bradshaw, and next to Farouk and Bradshaw, they look like two jobbers. I mean, they look like jobbers anyways, you know, but imagine putting them next to Farouk and Bradshaw. Same thing with the Dudleys. If you put them next to the Dudleys, they look like two pussies. You know, they're not cool enough and charismatic enough to be the Hardy Boys or Edge and Christian. You know, so they would be maybe like Mosh and Thrasher. They would be like on that level, you know, and especially considering the fact that Mosh and Thrasher eventually became jobbers. But nonetheless, the point I'm trying to make is that it wasn't easy to get into wrestling, right? And it's not just wrestling, motherfucks. Everything is easy to get into. And when I say get into, I mean there's very little initial investment and therefore very, very little payoff in the long run, right? That's why we have all of these like rappers, let's say, that are famous for like 2 months. You know what I mean? Even someone like 2 Chainz, right? Who I actually thought was pretty decent. You know what I'm saying? I remember him from his days as Titty Boy, motherfucks. If anybody remembers Titty Boy, shout out to you, you know? Like, even someone like him isn't going to stick around for too long. Because why would they keep 2 Chainz? It's like, all right, we've milked this guy dry for everything he's worth. Now it's time to focus on someone else. Oh, here's that little shit called Little Mosey, right? There's actually a dude called Chance the Rapper. I mean, they're really scraping the bottom of the barrel now. Chance the Rapper, motherfucks, all right, is the Lindsay Dorado of a rap. All right, that's what Chance the Rapper is and all these other jobbers. You know what I mean? No personality, no character. I actually saw the little show. It's like American Idol, but for rappers. And Chance the Rapper was like one of the judges. Maybe he was the guest judge. I don't know, motherfucks, right? And basically, he told this other rapper, he was like, you need to develop a personality, right? And I'm like, bro, your name is Chance the Rapper. Like, your entire thing is you're just the rapper. You're a rapper. You're a no personality jobber. You know what I mean? So that's what I'm saying. Like, if it becomes too easy, right? Like, if someone went out and watched 8 Mile, right? And you see what the fuck Eminem and his friends had to go through, specifically Eminem, to become big one day, right? All the shit that he had to go through. I mean, obviously it's a movie, but you know what I'm saying? Like, it was hard out there, right? It was hard. It was legitimately hard to have your mixtape heard, right? If anyone hasn't watched 8 Mile, one of the premises of the movie is that Eminem is an aspiring rapper in Detroit with his friends who are also aspiring rappers, right? And Eminem is basically trying to find a way to get people to hear his demo while he does freestyle battles, right? One of the central points of the movie is how will Eminem get his demo in the right hands so he'd get some radio play. Same thing with Hustle and Flow, if you've seen Hustle and Flow, right? It's about a pimp who's out there trying to become a rapper, basically, and it's really, really hard because no one will pay him any attention, right? He has to go out with a cassette tape, and he has to bribe people and buy weed for, like, some other rapper, you know what I mean? He has to play this, like, he has to go at it, you know what I'm saying? He has to go and make it work, you know what I'm saying, motherfucks? Right? Nowadays, you go on YouTube and you upload some shit, right? And you get a few viewers and you're good to go, you know what I mean? And then, like, you can go and suck dicks and be like, oh, come view my video, come do this, come do that, you know? The point I'm trying to make is it's much easier to become famous or become, you know, a known rapper today than it was back then, right? And as a result, the quality is compromised, right? Because if you had Eminem, who's trying so hard to do something, he must have an incredible amount of self-belief in himself, right? He must really think, like, I'm going to be the next big thing, and if only someone heard my shit, then I'd make it, right? Nowadays, it's like 100,000 people go put up a rap song, some jabron, some old bag, chooses one of them, and he's like, all right, this one, we're going to make this guy big for 2 months. We'll call him Lil Mosey, right? Like some horseshit, like, dumbass, like, rapper. These guys never going to have any longevity, you know what I mean? Whereas, like, actual rappers back then had to go through insane amounts of channels. Like, do you think that Eminem basically was like Dr. Dre heard Eminem's album or his mixtape and was like, this guy's the future? Absolutely not. What happened was he heard it. He was like, this is pretty good. Let's meet this motherfucker, right? Then they met, they sat down, they came up with an entire persona, right? Probably a 5 or 10 year plan on how Eminem's career could play out, right? They worked hard to make it happen. You know what I'm saying? It's not like Dr. Dre was like, oh, here's a white rapper, he'll be good. No, motherfuckers. They probably decided to make him blonde. They probably decided what he's going to talk about. They sat down. And when I say they, I don't just mean Dr. Dre and Eminem. I'm sure there were dozens of people involved in this, you know? People sitting down being like, all right, then we're going to do this. And then people are going to say this, you know? There's all this thought process behind it, right? And that's why Eminem is one of the most influential rappers of all time. You know? Don't worry about all that horseshit, like, all the horseshit singles that he released back in the day. You know, I'm talking about like the real Eminem, like not the commercial MTV singles, but the ones in the albums back in the day, in Marshall Mathers LP, right? That's why he was so influential, because he was out there. He was the product of a lot of people working together to make something that's gonna be long lasting. You know what I mean? Not now where it's like, oh, here's 2 Chainz for 2 months, right? 2 Chainz, just call them 2 months. You know what I'm saying? Here's 2 months. Right? And then all these rappers then fade into obscurity, you know what I mean? A lot of them, even the good ones. Some of them are good, you know what I'm saying? Like Cameron is a great rapper, right? He had his push. He didn't make much out of it in the sense of like he didn't become like a household name like other people do when they get their push. Like 50 Cent, for example, used his push correctly, right? And I don't want to talk about rap too much, but what I'm trying to show here is that like in wrestling, in rap, and in other forms of media, right? It's easier than ever to become somebody. Now, not to say that it's easy, right? Like there's a lot of people that are better than Chance the Rapper that still haven't gotten their break because they haven't been randomly chosen by like the overlord, by the guy that's like, we're gonna make this guy famous. Let's give him a contract, you know? Let's sign this motherfucker, you know? They haven't gotten that opportunity yet, and some of them never will. So it's still very difficult. But it's easy enough to allow people like Lindsay Dorado and Chance the Rapper through, right? Before that, there were gates, there were barriers to people like that entering these businesses, right? Like if you listen to Undertaker's podcast, Joe Rogan's podcast, I should say, with The Undertaker, Undertaker explains how he sat in a lobby for 8 months. You know, 8 months like a motherfucker waiting for his chance, right? Now, a lot of lesser men, a lot of Lindsay Dorados and Xavier Woodses would have quit, you know? And they would have been like, I'm going to go do video games instead, you know? Like, but Undertaker kept with it, right? And got his chance. And that's why we have Undertaker, motherfucks. That's what happens. Hard times, motherfucks. Hard times make hard men. You know what I mean? And nowadays, it's just too easy. Like, it's like everyone is being signed by WWE. You know? They, like, based on, like, I think it was the same podcast with Joe Rogan and Taker. But I believe it was either that or some other bullshit podcast that I heard, right? But basically, it sounded like I'm pretty sure it was Undertaker, but he basically said, or whoever it was, they basically said that, like, nowadays, WWE will just recruit at the NFL Combine. You know what I'm saying? Like, they'll just go there. Like, there's young men there who are trying to be NFL stars, right? Like, they're there to become NFL superstars. You know what I mean? And then WWE will go and they'll find a few that have some charisma, some personality, and they'll find a few that just aren't going to make it, unfortunately. Like, their stats are not sufficient to perhaps warrant, like, a real look from an NFL team, right? So they're like, okay, you got these motherfuckers that are, like, athletic enough, right? These people may have never wanted to be a wrestler. And WWE will recruit them. They'll be like, all right, we'll pay you this much. Come to the Performance Center. Let's see what we can do with you. You know? That's how easy it is. Like, you don't even have to try. You don't go try being good at another sport, and someone might recruit you in WWE, you know? That's what I'm getting at, motherfucks. It's becoming too easy, you know? There's very few people left that are pursuing the dream correctly. And a lot of these people end up in the indies now because that's like the general attitude. To go, if you ain't in the indies, you ain't shit. Get the fuck out of here. I'd rather be the football player that gets recruited out of college to go become WWE champion. You know what I'm saying? Like Brock Lesnar, basically. So that's what I'm getting at, motherfuckers. It's becoming too easy. That's part one of this motherfucker, you know? The fact that it's become too easy. And things that are too easy are not entertaining. The second part is that everything is a fucking cliche, right? That's probably even worse, motherfuckers. The amount of cliches that are happening right now is insane. Now, with that being said, I will say this, mother cucks. In the context of wrestling, cliches are tolerated because wrestling is campy, motherfucks. Wrestling is supposed to be cliche-ridden, and it's supposed to have a lot of dumb shit, you know? I remember this even as a kid. There was a storyline where The Rock saves Trish Stratus from some bad guy, maybe Vince McMahon, I don't remember. I think it was Vince McMahon, right? During the whole McMahon's face and Rikishi's ass thing, right? And then it shows The Rock and Trish Stratus making out backstage. right? Because they're like in love, you know what I'm saying? Like The Rock saved her. And I'm like, I thought, even as a kid, I'm like, man, this is some cliched shit. You know, oh, like the cool guy saves the hot girl and then now they're kissing, you know what I mean? I thought it was stupid. You know, especially because like Trish Stratus was like basically a heel like a month before that. You know, she was like the other woman, you know, like the mistress of Vince McMahon. So nonetheless, I remember thinking, wow, how cliche is that shit, you know? But it doesn't matter because in wrestling, cliches are okay. However, even in wrestling, there are limits to this shit, you know? You can't have a cliche again and again and again and again. That's why people get bored, right? That's why people get bored of the same exact storylines, you know? So perfect example, of course, Miro, you know? He was being held down in WWE, motherfucks, held down by creative, you know? And then he was free. He was set free and he went to AEW where all creative freedom was given back to him, right? And what did he do with it? He excelled by doing the exact same fucking thing he did in WWE. He did a wedding segment, right? And instead of being like the guy who pops out of the cake, he's the guy that gets attacked by the guy that pops out of the cake. So there you go, you know what I'm saying? It's the same shit, it's cliche, it's nonsense. I remember seeing an article being like, well, this is AEW's first wedding angle, and because it's first, they did well. What the fuck does that have to do with it, with anything? You know, like it's their first wedding angle? What, is there some sort of like book written on how to do wrestling wedding angles? You just watch 3 of them and you say, all right, they did this, this, and that. I'm gonna do something else. It's not simple, you know what I mean? It's horseshit. It's that same like AEW apologist mentality of, oh, AEW fucked up, but it's okay because they're new. You know, go fuck yourselves. So that's what I'm saying, right? Cliches need to go. Now think about a lot of cliches that you've seen, right? For example, I watch a lot of the TV shows. I really like TV shows, right? So that's why I like shows like, let's say, Sons of Anarchy or Rescue Me, motherfucks. Rescue Me, great show, by the way, right? Nip Tuck. A lot of these shows are FX shows for some reason. Nonetheless, I like them because they subvert expectations, right? So you have an expectation of what's going to happen. And then the show subverts it, you know? Like they actually do things that you haven't seen before. You know, you haven't seen it anywhere else. Some people say Game of Thrones is like this. I haven't watched enough to know. Didn't really seem that good to your boy, you know? Same thing with video games, right? I find, for example, that movies and video games that come from Asia, specifically, but not limited to Japan and South Korea, right? They are much more better written, right? Like they subvert expectations. They're not this horseshit down the middle nonsense that you see from American storytelling, right? Which is simple, bare bones, and cliche ridden, right? So for example, here's one cliche that I've noticed all over the motherfucker, right? So I'm watching Walking Dead, right? I keep hearing how Walking Dead's the best show ever. I'm watching it, it's the same exact thing every episode. I'm not compelled at all. But for some reason, I stick to it for a little bit, right? Then eventually I skip around and we get to a character named the Governor, right? And he's supposed to be the governor of this like group of people that are trying to essentially establish a society in the middle of the zombie apocalypse or whatever, right? And, you know, even though he's like a good leader in many ways, he's a bad guy, right? So I'm thinking to myself, all right, what's going to be his hook, you know, what's going to be his gimmick? Then it turns out that there's like some girl that he keeps chained that is a zombie. I don't remember. I think it was his daughter or something, right? Basically, it's like his daughter, and she's a full-blown zombie, right? But he like chains her to like a basement, right? So nobody can get to her because he doesn't want her to die, even though she's a zombie. Still his daughter to him, right? Now I thought to myself, that's pretty much when I turned it off. That's when I realized this show is garbage, because I'm like, yo, how many times have we seen this trope? You know, how many times have we seen like the reluctant father character who has like a daughter or a son or someone, a loved one, who is a zombie, right? We see this in every fucking zombie story, you know? This is like one of those things. It's like when you create a zombie story, you should immediately stop and think to yourself, at what point am I going to introduce the guy who has a zombie himself, you know? And everything. Now this was cool back in the day when it happened in like Resident Evil 2, where nobody knew about it, you know what I'm saying? Where it was like a new trope, right? But now it's everywhere. So these kind of cliches don't make things good, you know what I mean? People don't want to see the same ass thing again and again and again. And that's what wrestling has turned into. Now, like I said, storyline cliches in wrestling are fine. You know what I mean? They're fine. But cliches in terms of the real part of the medium of wrestling are problematic, right? So cliches in the overall arc of wrestling. Cliches in the in-ring product as well. You know what I mean? Like how many times are we going to see the small guy Hulk up and beat the big guy? You know, there comes a point where it's ridiculous, right? We are expected to believe this, and now it's gotten to the point where we know it's going to happen. That's pretty. If you really think about it, the criticism of John Cena was exactly what I'm saying, right? Cena no longer subverted expectations. The expectation of John Cena was exactly what I just said. He would go to the ring, right? Usually fighting guys bigger than him. Sometimes not, but a lot of times bigger than him, right? And what he would do is this. He would get his ass kicked for 25 minutes, and then he would like do the Cena comeback, hit the 5 moves of doom and win, right? And this got really old for people really fast, right? Myself included. I'm not immune to this shit, you know? Because you knew what to expect. Every Cena match, you knew what to expect. And WWE tried to counter by doing like cool spots in Cena matches, but it didn't really matter. You know, it didn't matter if John Cena was going to do the AA off a ladder or through like the stage, or who gives a shit. The point was an AA was going to finish the match. You knew it was going to happen. Now think about all the good things that have come from wrestling, right? Through what I've just said. Through subverting the expectations, right? Subverting the expectations, motherfucks. Perfect example, right? Nobody expects Eddie Guerrero to beat Brock Lesnar for the title, especially that close to WrestleMania. He does. Everyone loses their minds. You know what I'm saying? Subverting the expectations. Nobody ever expected to see Sting in WWE. He appears. Everyone loses their minds, right? People go crazy. Like, oh shit, Sting, motherfucks, right? Same exact thing with Kurt Angle in TNA, right? Nobody really expected that to happen. Boom, it happened, cucks. And here we are, motherfucks. You know? Same thing, right? And even in storylines, you know, any kind of twist and turn is good, you know? Like Rikishi being revealed as one of the guys that attacked Austin, right? Not the, I don't know if he was the driver anymore, I don't remember, but whatever, he attacked Austin, right? He went from face to heel in one day, subverting the expectations. You have this guy who's a lovable, fat-ass dancer, and all of a sudden he's like a piece of shit, you know? New music, new everything. That's what it's all about, right? Or even Kane taking off his mask, creating suspense and subverting expectations. That's what makes good storytelling, right? Think about any good story that you really like, right? It has to have probably some elements of this, or it's some down the middle but very well done type of story. They exist too, motherfucks. There's stories that are down the middle, they subvert no expectations, but they're so well created, right? So well written that like you can't help but love them. But these are the two things that need to happen. Things need to be hard, right? And you need to subvert expectations. This is a problem with technology that is becoming more and more apparent, with everyone being able to create shit now and everyone being able to be a wrestler. You know, the entire point of wrestling, I would argue even, has to do and revolves around subverting expectations. That's like the one advantage wrestling has over every other medium in history that presents itself the same way, right? So for example, if you take boxing, right? Tyson Fury, great comeback story, right? The comeback story only became great after he beat Deontay Wilder. Because until he beats Deontay Wilder, nothing happened, right? Motherfucks, he didn't make the comeback. You know, it's only a good comeback story if Tyson Fury wins. In wrestling, you control who wins. So you can subvert the expectation exactly that way, right? Rey Mysterio coming in at number 2 at the Royal Rumble, right? People don't expect him to win. I mean, everyone's like, man, it'd be cool if Rey Mysterio won. He's one of the dark horses, right? But he wasn't like a main eventer at the time, and he came in at number 2. So the show is telling you specifically, don't get your hopes up too much, cuck, about Rey Mysterio. And then he ends up winning, you know what I mean? Which creates a legitimate moment. Same thing you could argue with Daniel Bryan. I mean, I think it was horseshit and predictable, but nonetheless, right? You stack the odds against him, and people for some reason, people like really get concerned and zero in on the idea that the storyline is like overcoming the odds. That's what it is on paper. The real storyline is subverting expectations. The expectation is that someone like that cannot beat Triple H and Orton and Batista in one night. That's the expectation, right? But it happens, right? It happens and you're like, holy shit, my expectations, whew, out the window, motherfucks. That's what I'm saying. That's what makes wrestling good, you know? Every twist and turn in wrestling uses this philosophy. So, with that being said, motherfucks, what can we do to improve wrestling? Very simple. Make it harder to be a WWE superstar, you know? This is more difficult now with the territories coming back or whatever the fuck people are saying. You know, all these horseshit indie promotions, right? Because WWE now feels the need to sign people like Cassius Ohno, right? So he can't go to ROH. And Cassius Ohno is like never going to be anything in WWE, but at least he's not an ROH being a competitor, you know what I mean? So that's kind of a problem, right? Obviously the structure of WCW versus WWE is much better than WWE eating up everybody. But whatever, can't do anything about that. So what can we do? Hire people that understand storytelling, right? I don't mean people that understand wrestling. You don't need to understand wrestling to be a good storyteller. That's probably one of the biggest misconceptions in the history of wrestling, right? Like people saying like, oh, Dixie Carter doesn't know anything about wrestling. What is there to fucking know about wrestling, honestly, you know? People act as if it's like rocket science. It's two men pretending to fight. What is there to know about it? You can look at it and be like, oh, this is good or this is not good, you know? What she doesn't know anything about is storytelling, right? That's the problem with her. Because if you know storytelling and you understand how to tell a correct story, especially if you're good enough to tell it through your own medium that you're into right now, right? Then you're able to sign the correct wrestlers and write the correct storylines, or at least hire the right writers to write the storylines, right? That's why, and for example, like all these niche video games, right? There's all these video games that have like quote unquote famous story writers. And people are like, oh, I heard Mitsunori Kamaguchi wrote the story for this game, right? And I'm like, who the fuck is that? You know, nobody knows these guys, but people do know them, right? Because they like their storytelling. But nobody really gives a shit about, like, you know, I don't know, the director of the game. Nobody gives a fuck. I mean, people do, I'm sure, but you know what I'm saying, right? Storytelling is the only way that we can fix this shit, right? We need good stories, compelling stories. None of this, like you know, fucking ABC nonsense that we have nowadays, you know? Like, oh shit, Kip Sabian's gonna get married to Penelope Ford. I hope nobody interferes with the wedding, you know what I mean? Like, who's the retard that wrote that? Like, everybody knew something was gonna happen, you know what I mean? So there you go, motherfucks. I hope you've understood what I've been trying to tell you, cucks. Once again, subvert expectations and make it hard. That's how you get good writers, right? And that's how you get good performers. Good writers plus good performers equals good end result. Nowadays, we have neither of those things, and that's why we have things like Orange Cassidy. All right? There you go, motherfucks. Peace out. Hey, AEW, does AEW even have writers? Or is it just these cocksuckers just go out and do whatever the fuck they want? They cut their own promos, have their own storylines. Nonetheless, it is what it is. See you later, cucks.